The air was thick with the scent of alien trees, their twisted trunks reaching up to the sky like giant fingers. Dr. Ethan Cole walked carefully through the dense forest, his boots crunching softly against the underbrush. He had been on this planet for days, studying its wildlife and gathering medical samples for a research project. But this was not the place he had planned to visit that day. He had followed a strange signal on his tracking device, which had led him here. The sky above was a dull orange, a strange color that always made Ethan feel as if the planet was on the edge of a dream. He had been here before, on peaceful missions to learn more about the Cerithian people. Their world was rich in resources and had become an ally to Earth. However, Ethan had never ventured into the deep wilderness. There was always something new to discover, but the wild was not his specialty. As a medical officer, his job was usually much safer, treating people in cities or research stations. But something today had felt different. The signal on his device had changed. It was faint, a distress signal, unlike anything he had ever seen. After what felt like hours of walking through the thick forest, Ethan noticed something strange. Among the ferns and vines, something shiny caught his eye. He bent down and pushed the leaves aside. There, lying half-hidden beneath a large rock, was a figure. At first, he thought it was just an animal, but as he approached, his heart skipped a beat. It was a woman. Ethan knelt beside her, his mind racing. Her body was covered in cuts, and her face was bruised. Blood stained the ground around her, and her breathing was shallow. She looked nothing like the humans he knew. Her skin was a soft shade of silver, and her hair was a deep shade of blue, almost glowing under the strange sky. For a moment, Ethan didn't know what to do. He had never seen anyone like her before. She wasn't human, but that didn't matter. She needed help. Without hesitation, Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out his first aid kit. The woman's clothes, though torn, were made of some material he didn't recognize, almost metallic in nature. His fingers moved quickly, assessing her injuries. A deep gash across her arm was the most serious. The bleeding was slow but steady. "Hold on," Ethan whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. He cleaned the wound carefully, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Her eyes fluttered, but she didn't wake up. Ethan's mind raced as he worked. He had no idea who she was or where she had come from. He had never seen an alien like this before. Her beauty was unlike anything he had ever imagined, even though her current state was far from graceful. But there was something about her, something that told him she was important, that her life was more than just a random meeting. As he continued to work, he heard a soft groan. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing bright violet eyes that stared at him in confusion. She tried to sit up but winced in pain, her hand instinctively reaching for the wound on her arm. "Easy," Ethan said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder to keep her still. He spoke slowly, trying to calm her. "You're hurt. Let me help you." She looked at him, her gaze sharp despite her condition. Her mouth moved, but the words she spoke were unfamiliar to him. He didn't understand her language, but he could see the panic in her eyes. "I'm here to help," he repeated in a calm voice, his accent smooth. "You're safe now." The woman's gaze softened slightly, and she stopped trying to move. Instead, she watched him as he finished treating her wounds. As Ethan carefully applied a bandage, he couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. He had heard stories of alien civilizations, of distant worlds and strange beings, but this was real. The woman in front of him was real. She was alive, and she needed him. Ethan finished tending to her injuries and sat back, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. The woman was still looking at him, though her expression had changed. There was curiosity in her eyes now, and something else, something he couldn't quite read. For a moment, the two of them just sat in silence, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves in the wind. Then the woman spoke again, but this time, Ethan understood one word. "Thank you." Ethan smiled, relief flooding through him. "You're welcome," he said softly. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the gesture, though there was still uncertainty in her eyes. "I'm Ethan," he said, hoping she might understand. "And you are?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting as if she were searching for the right word. "Alara," she finally said, her voice soft but clear. "Alara," Ethan repeated. "It's nice to meet you. Now let's get you somewhere safe." Alara didn't argue. She simply nodded, and with Ethan's help, she slowly rose to her feet, still unsteady but grateful for his kindness. Little did Ethan know, this chance encounter would change both of their lives forever. The following days were a blur for Dr. Ethan Cole. After the strange encounter with Alara, he had made it his priority to help her recover. She had been too weak to travel, and the remote forest offered no easy way out. They set up a small camp by the creek where Ethan had first found her, using the materials he had on hand. Despite the discomfort, Alara's condition slowly improved, and her mysterious, otherworldly beauty remained, even in her weakened state. Ethan spent his days gathering food and fresh water, while Alara rested. He tried to talk to her, but her language was foreign to him. She seemed to understand his basic words, but when she tried to speak, the language was unlike anything he had ever heard. The sounds were melodic, yet sharp, with unfamiliar tones that didn't match anything from Earth's languages. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky tinged with purple, Alara spoke to him in her language again. Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of frustration in her tone. Ethan had grown used to her silent gaze by now, but this time, her eyes seemed to plead for understanding. Ethan sat down beside her, offering her a small plate of food. He hoped she would take it, but Alara didn't seem interested. Instead, she reached out her hand, and her eyes locked onto his. She spoke again, and this time, Ethan could see the determination in her expression. "I don't understand you," Ethan said gently, holding her gaze. "But I'm trying. I promise." Alara looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. She hesitated, then reached into a small pouch tied to her waist. It was the only personal item she had left. From the pouch, she pulled a small, shining stone, smooth and round, glowing faintly with an inner light. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. The stone seemed to hum softly in his hand as Alara placed it in his palm. Her gaze was intense, watching his every movement closely. This is yours," Ethan asked quietly, though he didn't expect a response. Alara nodded, her eyes never leaving the stone. She seemed to be waiting for something, but Ethan wasn't sure what. He stared at the stone for a long moment, wondering what it was. It wasn't like any gemstone or material he had ever encountered before. It was beautiful, but there was something otherworldly about it. He set the stone down on the ground between them and gave Alara a questioning look. She gave a subtle nod, as if encouraging him to keep it. "I don't know what this is," Ethan said, still speaking in simple terms. "But I'll take care of it. I'll figure it out." Alara's expression softened, and she gave him a small, appreciative smile. It was the first time Ethan had seen her smile, and it filled him with a sense of warmth. Despite the uncertainty, he could see that she trusted him. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He knew he had to help her, no matter the cost. The next morning, Alara seemed stronger. She sat up, her back straight, and looked around at their surroundings with more focus than before. She still seemed to be recovering, but the fear in her eyes had faded, replaced by something else. Curiosity, maybe even a spark of hope. Ethan took the opportunity to try communicating again, pointing to himself. "Ethan," he said slowly, tapping his chest. Alara watched him closely, then repeated, "Ethan." He smiled. She had said his name, though it was more of an attempt than a perfect match. Still, it felt like progress. Then she pointed to herself, her hand brushing against her chest. She hesitated, as if unsure of how to say her name. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "Alara." "Alara," Ethan repeated, nodding. He didn't quite understand her, but he was starting to feel a connection to her, a sense of trust building between them. For the next few days, Ethan worked hard to learn more about Alara's language. Though progress was slow, she would point to objects, and he would try to guess their meanings. He taught her simple words in English, and she repeated them with careful attention. As they spent more time together, Ethan began to notice small things about Alara that intrigued him. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Despite her obvious strength and regal posture, she was kind and patient, always gentle with him, even when she was in pain. Her alien culture was nothing like Earth's, but she had a quiet grace that made Ethan feel at ease, even in the face of the unknown. One afternoon, while resting near the creek, Alara suddenly began to gesture toward the sky. She pointed upward, her eyes wide with wonder, as if trying to show Ethan something. He followed her gaze and noticed a small ship, far in the distance, moving slowly across the sky. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The ship wasn't human. It was too sleek, too advanced. Was it searching for Alara? Was it the people who had attacked her? Alara's face tightened with worry, and she turned back to him. She pointed to the ship, then shook her head, as if trying to say something important. But the words were lost in translation. Ethan didn't need to understand her language to know that something dangerous was coming. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Alara's eyes shift from the distant ship back to him. There was no mistaking it. The fear in her gaze told him everything he needed to know. The ship was coming for her, and it wasn't there to offer help. He quickly looked around, his mind racing. They were in the open, near the creek, with nowhere to hide. He didn't know how far the ship had traveled or how much time they had before it reached the planet's surface, but he knew one thing. They couldn't stay here. "We have to move," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. Alara nodded, understanding his words even if she couldn't speak them. She had been through too much already. Her strong, steady gaze confirmed what he feared. She knew what was at stake. Without another word, they gathered their belongings. Ethan grabbed his medical kit, a small bag of supplies, and the glowing stone Alara had given him. She, in turn, took a deep breath, her eyes glancing once more at the ship in the sky before she started walking briskly. The dense forest that surrounded them offered some cover, but it wasn't much. The trees were tall and thick, their branches twisting like strange fingers reaching out to grab them. Ethan kept a close eye on Alara as she moved, her alien strength evident in every step. Despite her earlier injuries, she was still weak, but she wasn't showing it. The determination in her eyes kept Ethan going, spurring him forward. They walked for hours, deeper into the wilderness. Ethan tried to keep his mind clear, focusing on getting them to safety, but every so often, he would glance up, half expecting to see the ship growing larger in the sky. It was hard to shake the feeling that they were being hunted. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a small cave tucked beneath the roots of a massive tree. It was hidden, dark, and narrow, perfect for staying out of sight. Ethan turned to Alara, his face set with concern. "We'll rest here for now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if they would be safe, but it was the best option they had. Alara nodded, though she seemed hesitant. She glanced toward the sky again, as if she could feel the presence of the ship even though it was no longer visible. Inside the cave, they settled down on the ground. Ethan made a small fire using the sticks and leaves he had gathered along the way, the flames flickering softly in the dim light. He offered Alara some food, but she declined, her mind clearly elsewhere. Instead, she sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the fire, deep in thought. Ethan sat next to her, his eyes constantly scanning the entrance of the cave. There was no way of knowing if the ship was still searching for them. The forest was quiet now, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by an eerie stillness. "Alara," Ethan began softly, trying to break the silence. "I don't know who they are, but I'll protect you. I won't let them take you." Alara looked at him, Her violet eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and worry. She reached into her pouch and pulled out the glowing stone once again. This time, she handed it to him without hesitation. Ethan took it carefully, feeling its warmth in his hands. He didn't understand what it was, but somehow it felt important. He looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What is this, Alara? What's so special about it?" Alara's gaze softened, and she placed her hand over his, guiding the stone back to him. She spoke a few words in her own language, but Ethan didn't understand. He could tell, however, that it was important. Her voice was filled with emotion, and she seemed to be trying to convey something. He held the stone up to the light of the fire, watching as it glowed even brighter, casting strange shadows on the walls of the cave. There was a deep energy in it, a power that Ethan couldn't quite grasp. Whatever it was connected to her, and maybe even to the reason why she had been attacked. Suddenly, there was a sound outside the cave. It was faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the medical kit, his mind racing. Were they here already? Alara looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. She stood up, moving silently toward the back of the cave. Ethan followed her, trying to stay as quiet as possible. They crouched low, listening as the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. The forest outside was eerily quiet again, but Ethan didn't dare make a sound. The ship might have left, but its crew was still here. They had to be careful. Time seemed to slow as they waited. The footsteps stopped at the entrance of the cave. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as he held his breath. They had to make it out of here. They had to move. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps faded. Alara looked at Ethan, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's not safe yet," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded. "I know, but we'll get through this. I promise." They stayed in the cave, hiding, waiting for the right moment to leave. Every second felt like a lifetime. Ethan's thoughts were filled with one question. What did they want with Alara? And how far would they go to find her? The hours in the cave stretched on, each one heavier than the last. The night seemed endless, with the crackling of the small fire their only source of comfort. Ethan and Alara remained hidden, barely daring to speak, the quiet outside almost unbearable. Ethan was growing restless. The footsteps he had heard earlier still haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, even though the forest outside appeared still and empty. Whoever, or whatever, had been searching for them was still out there. Alara sat in the corner of the cave, her knees drawn up to her chest, her eyes never leaving the entrance. She didn't speak much, but Ethan could tell she was deep in thought. The stone she had given him earlier still lay beside him, glowing faintly in the dim light. It seemed to pulse with energy, like a heartbeat. He wondered about its power, about why it was so important to her. Alara suddenly shifted, breaking the silence. She stood and walked over to the fire, her movements smooth but tense. She seemed to be gathering her strength, though it was clear that she was still not fully recovered. Ethan stood up too, concerned. "Alara," he said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "What's going on? What's in the stone?" She looked at him, her violet eyes filled with emotion. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand over her heart, as if trying to explain something deeply personal. She then pointed to the stone, and with a determined look, she spoke in her alien language. Ethan couldn't understand her words, but he could hear the urgency in her voice. He took a deep breath, realizing that this was her way of communicating something important. He motioned to the stone, then to her, asking without words if she wanted him to do something with it. Alara nodded slightly, urging him to hold it. Ethan gingerly picked up the stone, feeling its warmth spread through his hand. As soon as he touched it, a strange sensation filled his body, like an energy flowing through him, something beyond what he had ever experienced. The stone seemed to hum, sending ripples of power across the cave. Alara watched him closely, her eyes widening as though she were witnessing something extraordinary. Ethan's mind raced. What was happening? Was this what she had been trying to tell him? Was the stone more than just a simple object? In that moment, the stone flared brightly, casting a blinding light that filled the entire cave. Ethan gasped and quickly pulled his hand away. The light slowly faded, and when his vision cleared, he saw something he could never have expected. Alara was standing before him, but she was no longer the same. She was glowing, her body surrounded by an ethereal aura. The air around her seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, and her violet eyes shone like stars. She looked more regal, more powerful than ever before. The stone was now hovering in the air before her, floating as if controlled by an invisible force. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Alara, what is this?" he whispered. She smiled, her expression filled with quiet pride. She placed her hand over her chest again, then pointed to herself, as if confirming what Ethan had feared. She wasn't just an ordinary alien. She was something much more, something far more important. Alara spoke again, her voice softer now, almost as if she were explaining something sacred. She placed a hand over the glowing stone, and in the blink of an eye, the stone flew back into her grasp. The energy around her seemed to settle, and the glow slowly dimmed. I don't understand," Ethan murmured. "Who are you really, Alara?" She met his gaze, and in that moment, Ethan saw the weight of her history, the burden she carried. She was not just an injured stranger in need of help. She was someone with a powerful purpose, someone whose presence could change everything. Alara took a deep breath, and this time, her voice was clear, though still in her language. As she spoke, the stone seemed to glow faintly once more. Ethan's mind struggled to understand, but he could feel her meaning deep down. This was something far greater than a simple survival story. Finally, after a long pause, Alara spoke a few words that Ethan could understand. "I am the daughter of the Cerithian king," she said, her voice steady. "I carry the legacy of my people." Ethan's eyes widened. "The king's daughter," he repeated, trying to process her words. The Cerithians had always been a peaceful and highly advanced species. They were allies of Earth, but the idea of royalty, of a royal bloodline, had never crossed his mind before. "Yes," Alara confirmed, her gaze unwavering. "The ship you saw earlier was sent by those who seek to destroy my people. They will stop at nothing to find me. I carry the key to their downfall." Ethan's mind raced. "The stone, it's the key." Alara nodded. "Yes, it is a weapon, a powerful force capable of stopping them. But it's not just any weapon. It is tied to my bloodline. Without me, the stone is nothing. But with me, it can defeat them." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. Alara wasn't just a survivor. She was the hope of her people. And she had trusted him with the stone, with her life. "We have to keep moving," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "If they're after you, they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Alara nodded, her resolve clear. "They won't stop, but neither will I." Together, they would have to face the threat coming for them. But Ethan now knew the truth. Alara wasn't just someone in need of help. She was a warrior, a princess, and she had a destiny to fulfill. The air in the forest felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to happen. Ethan and Alara had been on the move for days now, always keeping to the shadows, always one step ahead of the unknown enemies who seemed to be hunting them relentlessly. Every rustling of the trees, every distant sound, made Ethan's heart race. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were always being watched. They had found another cave, a small one hidden beneath the roots of a massive tree. It was safe for now, but they knew it wouldn't be for long. The stone Alara had given him pulsed softly, its light growing brighter with each passing day. He didn't understand how it worked or what it truly meant, but he could feel its power. And he could feel that Alara's trust in him was growing stronger too. As they settled into the cave, Ethan tried to focus. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan. They needed to stop the people who were chasing them before they caused any more harm. He couldn't let Alara down. She had already risked so much, and now it was his turn to do whatever it took to protect her. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked quietly, looking over at Alara. She was sitting near the entrance of the cave, her eyes scanning the horizon. She hadn't spoken much in the past few days, but her silence spoke volumes. It was clear that the weight of their situation was weighing heavily on her. Alara looked up at him, her violet eyes still full of that quiet strength. She didn't need to say anything. The look she gave him was enough. She was worried, yes, but she also knew that she couldn't do this alone. The fate of her people, and the future, was now tied to their survival. Ethan sat down next to her, taking a deep breath. "We need to figure out where we go from here. We can't keep hiding forever. Eventually, they'll find us." Alara nodded. She stood up, walking over to the small pile of supplies they had gathered. She retrieved the glowing stone, holding it carefully in her hands. It seemed to glow brighter whenever she touched it, as though it recognized her. "There's something I haven't told you yet," Alara said, her voice soft but serious. Ethan's eyes widened. "What is it?" Alara paused, as though choosing her words carefully. "The stone is not only a weapon. It is also a map, a guide. It can lead us to my people, the Cirithians, the ones who are still safe. They are scattered across the galaxy, hidden from the ones who are hunting us." Ethan felt a wave of hope wash over him. "You mean there are others out there? Other Cirithians?" Alara nodded. "Yes, and they may be able to help us fight back. But how do we find them?" Ethan asked. "We don't even know where to start." Alara looked down at the stone, which seemed to glow even brighter in her hands. "The stone will show us the way. We just have to trust it. It will guide us to the nearest Cirithian outpost, where we can find the help we need." Ethan's heart raced. This was it. This was their chance to turn the tables and fight back. But there was one problem. The enemies chasing them weren't just going to sit back and wait. They were closing in, and if they didn't act fast, Alara's people might be lost forever. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked, standing up. "We need to move quickly," Alara replied. "The stone has already shown me the direction we need to go. But we must be careful. The ones hunting us know how to track us. They've been watching us for days." Ethan clenched his fists. He was ready. Ready to protect Alara. Ready to help her save her people. He couldn't sit idly by any longer. It was time to take action. They gathered their supplies once again, making sure they had everything they needed. Alara kept the glowing stone close to her chest, as if it were a lifeline. Ethan checked his equipment, making sure his medical kit was fully stocked. If they were going to make it through whatever came next, they needed to be prepared for anything. "Let's go," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We'll follow the stone. We'll find your people, and we'll stop the ones who are after you." Alara gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Ethan. I couldn't have done this without you." Together, they stepped out of the cave, the dense forest surrounding them. The stone in Alara's hands glowed brightly, casting an ethereal light in the dark woods. Ethan kept a close watch on their surroundings as they moved, but he could feel a growing sense of hope inside him. They had a plan. They had a chance. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, but Alara's focus never wavered. The stone guided them, its light flickering like a beacon in the night. Ethan trusted her, trusted that they were headed in the right direction. But even as they moved deeper into the woods, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every sound, every rustle in the trees, felt like an echo of something. Someone watching them. He glanced at Alara, whose expression was calm but alert. She felt it too. They weren't safe yet. The night was eerily quiet as Ethan and Alara moved through the forest. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant calls of creatures that lived deep in the woods. Alara held the glowing stone close, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead of them. The stone's light flickered in the shadows, guiding their path, but Ethan could tell they weren't as alone as they hoped. The feeling of being watched hadn't left them since they left the cave. "We're close," Alara whispered, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I can feel it." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. They were on the edge of finding the help they needed. The Cirithians, the ones who could finally turn the tide against the enemies hunting them. But he also knew that the moment they reached them, they would be vulnerable. Their enemies would be waiting. As they walked, Alara suddenly stopped. Her eyes narrowed, and she raised a hand to signal for silence. Ethan stopped beside her, his breath held. The air was still, and the glow of the stone seemed to flicker faster, its light pulsing as if sensing something. Then, a sound, soft at first, then growing louder, reached their ears. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Someone was approaching, and they weren't trying to hide. Ethan's heart raced. He glanced at Alara, who looked back at him, her expression calm but tense. She had been through so much already, and the last thing he wanted was for her to be hurt again. They had come too far to fail now. "Hide," Alara murmured. She gestured to a thick clump of bushes nearby, and without a word, they moved toward it. Ethan crouched low, trying to stay as quiet as possible, while Alara's glowing stone dimmed, blending into the shadows around them. They waited, barely breathing, as the footsteps grew closer. Ethan's hand hovered over the medical kit at his side, ready for anything. His eyes flicked from the path to Alara, his thoughts racing. Were these the ones hunting them, or had they finally found the Cirithians? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped just a few meters away. Ethan's pulse quickened as he waited, his body tense, ready to spring into action if necessary. He didn't know how many enemies were out there, but he wasn't going to let Alara face them alone. Alara's hand reached out and touched his arm gently, signaling for him to stay still. Her eyes met his for a moment, her expression full of resolve. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Then, out of the shadows, figures appeared. 3 tall, armored figures stepped into the moonlight, their movements deliberate and precise. They were not human. Ethan could see that immediately. Their features were angular and sharp, with long limbs and dark, reflective eyes that glimmered in the faint light. They were searching, looking around, moving as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. These were the ones hunting them. They were not just soldiers, they were something far worse. He had seen enough to know that these creatures were not interested in negotiation. They wanted Alara, and they would stop at nothing to get her. Alara, sensing the danger, tightened her grip on the stone. Her gaze never left the figures, her stance poised. She was ready, just like Ethan was. Together, they would fight if it came to that. But before they could make a move, the lead figure, taller and more imposing than the others, spoke, his voice a low growl that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "We know you're here, Cirithian," the creature said, his voice echoing through the trees. "You can't hide from us forever. Surrender now, and we may let you live." Alara's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The stone in her hands glowed brightly once again, its light pulsing with energy. Ethan could feel the power radiating from it, almost as if it were alive, waiting for the right moment to strike. The creature's eyes narrowed as he looked directly at Alara. "You think you can stop us with that little stone? It won't be enough." Ethan felt a surge of confidence. He couldn't let them scare him, and he certainly couldn't let them take Alara. He glanced at her, giving her a silent nod of support. It was time to act. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, his movements fast and precise. Ethan barely had time to react before he was grabbed by one of the other figures. He struggled, but the grip was like iron, strong and unyielding. Alara stepped forward, her hand raised, the stone glowing brighter than ever before. Without warning, The stone erupted in a blinding flash of light. The air seemed to hum with energy, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The creatures staggered back, shielding their eyes. But it was too late. The power of the stone had already done its work. The lead figure roared in pain, his body enveloped in the light. The other two creatures stepped back, clearly startled by the unexpected strength of the stone. They had underestimated Alara, and now they were paying the price. Ethan took advantage of the moment, twisting free from his captor's grip and grabbing a nearby branch. He swung it with all his strength, knocking the creature off balance. The figure stumbled back, dazed. Alara stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with authority. "You will not take me. Not today." The remaining two creatures hissed in fury, their eyes burning with hatred, but it was clear they were no longer in control. The power of the stone had shifted the balance, and now Alara was ready to finish this. "We're not done yet," one of the creatures spat. But before it could make another move, the stone flared once more, sending a shockwave through the air that knocked them all back. The fight was over. The enemies were defeated, retreating into the forest, their plans thwarted. Ethan and Alara stood together, breathless but victorious. They had made it through the worst of it. And now they could finally begin their journey to find the Cerithians, the ones who would help them defeat their enemies once and for all. "We're not alone anymore," Ethan said, his voice filled with hope. "We have each other." Alara smiled, the weight of everything she had been through lifting just a little. "And we have a future." Together, they would face whatever came next, and with the power of the stone in her hands, Alara knew they had a fighting chance.